The scent of $1 million worth of white roses filled the air at the Greystone Mansion. The guests, a who's who of Silicon Valley and Hollywood, held their breath. Emmett Rowe, the tech billionaire who had clawed his way up from nothing, stood at the altar, a man who had everything. And standing before him was Lila Montgomery, the woman who was his final triumph. But in the moments before he was to say, "I do," Emmett found a letter. It wasn't a love note. It was a single sheet of paper, tucked away in a place no one else would look, containing a secret so devastating it would not only stop the wedding, it would ignite a firestorm of deceit, betrayal, and corporate espionage that threatened to burn his entire empire to the ground. The California sun had the decency to be perfect. It streamed through the grand arched windows of Greystone Mansion's master suite, catching the diamond dust in the air and making the entire room sparkle. Emmett Rowe, however, saw none of it. He was staring at his own reflection in the gold leaf mirror, a stranger in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that felt more like a costume than clothing. At 34, Emmett had the kind of face that photographers loved and rivals underestimated. Sharp jaw, intense gray eyes that seemed to be constantly running calculations, and a stillness that unnerved people. He wasn't handsome in the soft, polished way of old money. He was forged. He'd built his empire, Rowe Innovations, from a garage in San Jose, with nothing but a revolutionary data compression algorithm and a reservoir of ambition so deep it was almost terrifying. Now that company was valued at $12 billion, and he was marrying Lila Montgomery. Lila was, by all accounts, as perfect as the sun outside. A former art curator with a pedigree that traced back to East Coast shipping magnates, she was grace and beauty personified. She smoothed his rough edges, charmed his investors, and looked breathtaking on his arm. She was the final acquisition, the piece that proved he had truly arrived. Nervous? Emmett's eyes flicked to the mirror's reflection. Marcus Thorne, his best man, his CFO, his oldest friend, was leaning against the doorframe, a lopsided grin on his face. He was the opposite of Emmett. Blonde, easygoing, born with the silver spoon Emmett had to melt down and forge for himself. They'd met at Stanford, Marcus the legacy admission, and Emmett the scholarship kid. Marcus had been the first to see the genius simmering behind Emmett's quiet intensity. "I'm not nervous," Emmett said, his voice a low rumble. He adjusted the silk tie, the fabric cool against his skin. "I'm cataloging." Marcus laughed, a genuine, booming sound. "Cataloging? It's a wedding, not a server migration. You're allowed to feel something, Jay. It's your wedding day." Feel something. Emmett did feel something, a strange, hollow echo in the center of his chest. He'd told himself it was just the sheer scale of the event. 500 guests, a security detail that rivaled a presidential visit, a celebrity chef flown in from Paris, a prenuptial agreement that had taken 6 months and a team of lawyers to hammer out. Lila had laughed it off. "It's just business, darling, to protect us both." She'd been so reasonable, so understanding. She had even suggested a few clauses herself, through her family's lawyer, additions that seemed innocuous, mostly about intellectual property rights within the marriage. His lawyers had shrugged. It was unusual, but not unheard of. "It's just big," Emmett finally conceded, turning from the mirror. "This whole thing, it's a production." "It's your production," Marcus corrected, clapping him on the shoulder. "You wanted the best. You got the best. The best venue, the best food, the best woman. Lila is one of a kind." Emmett nodded. She was. She had to be. He walked over to the antique mahogany dresser, its surface polished to a dark, watery sheen. On it sat a small velvet-lined box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on the worn fabric, were his grandfather's cufflinks. Simple silver ovals, tarnished with age, engraved with a C that looked nothing like the sleek, modern logo of Rowe Innovations. They were the only thing he had left of the man who had raised him, a steelworker from Oakland who had died long before Emmett had even written his first line of code. His grandfather had taught him one thing above all else. "Trust is the only currency that matters, Emmett. You lose it, you're bankrupt, no matter how much money is in the bank." He reached for the cufflinks, his fingers brushing against them. This was his anchor. This was real. The tuxedo was a costume. The mansion was a rental. But these cufflinks were his history. As his fingers closed around the left cufflink, they brushed against a piece of paper tucked underneath it. It was small, folded into a tight square, almost hidden in the dark velvet. It wasn't there this morning when he'd placed the box on the dresser. The staff had been in and out, the florists, the planners, his tailor. Anyone could have put it there. He frowned, pulling it out. The paper was thick, expensive stationery, creamy white. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, a precise, elegant script. It wasn't a note of congratulations. It wasn't a joke from one of his groomsmen. It was 4 short lines that seemed to suck all the air, all the light, all the warmth from the perfect California day. She isn't who you think she is. Ask her about Lake Como. Last August. Ask her about Marcus. Before you sign your life away, check the IP clauses in your prenup. The world tilted. The buzz of the wedding preparations outside faded into a low hum. The names on the page seemed to writhe like snakes. Lila, Marcus, the 2 people in his life he trusted implicitly, his partner in life and his partner in business, the pillars of his world. Lake Como, last August. He had been in Seoul, closing the biggest deal of his life, a grueling 3-week negotiation that had almost broken him. Lila had said she was going on a girls' trip to Italy to distress. He'd encouraged it. He remembered the pictures she sent, sun-drenched villas, smiling selfies with friends he'd never met. Marcus. Marcus had been holding down the fort in San Jose, or so he'd said. Emmett, what is it? Marcus's voice cut through the fog. He had pushed off the doorframe and was walking towards him, his smile faltering as he saw Emmett's face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Emmett's hand closed around the note, crumpling it into a tight ball. His mind, the same mind that could process 1 billion data points in a second, was racing, connecting dots he had refused to see. Lila's sudden insistence on that trip, the vague answers about who she was with, a flicker of something in her eyes when he'd asked to see more photos. Marcus being unusually hard to reach for a few days during that same period, citing a family emergency, the IP clauses. Unusual but not unheard of. His lawyer's words echoed in his ears. Lila's family lawyer was notoriously aggressive. They'd framed it as protecting her potential future contributions to the brand. At the time, it seemed absurd, but he'd been so exhausted from the Soul deal, so eager to make her happy, that he had signed off on it. The clauses were buried deep, but he remembered the gist. Any intellectual property developed during the marriage, even tangentially related to Rowe Innovations, would be considered joint marital property. It was a corporate Trojan horse. Jay, you're scaring me, man. What's in your hand? Marcus asked, his voice laced with concern. He reached out. Emmett flinched back, his eyes, once gray and calculating, now burning like hot coals. He looked at his best friend, the easy smile, the concerned eyes. Was it all a lie? Was this man who had stood by him for 15 years the architect of his ruin? He couldn't breathe. The perfect tuxedo was a straitjacket. The gilded room was a cage. He looked from Marcus to the door, the path to the altar where 500 people and his beautiful, perfect fiancée were waiting. His grandfather's voice was a whisper in his memory. Trust is the only currency that matters. In that moment, Emmett Rowe realized he was bankrupt. Time for Emmett Rowe had always been a quantifiable asset. It was measured in nanoseconds of processing speed, in quarters of fiscal growth, in the precise, relentless march toward market domination. Now it had fractured into 1 million jagged shards of before and after. Before the note. After the note. Emmett, talk to me. Marcus's voice was closer now, a carefully modulated blend of friendship and authority. It was the same voice he used on nervous investors and stubborn board members. We're on a schedule. The planners are getting antsy. Lila is waiting. Lila is waiting. The phrase landed like a stone in Emmett's gut. Waiting for what? For him to walk down that aisle and legally bind himself to a lie? To hand over the keys to the kingdom he had bled for? He held up the crumpled ball of paper. This, he said, his voice raw, Someone left this for me. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to confusion. A note? What is it? A prank? If one of the guys from the board sent you some last-minute joke, it's not a joke. Emmett's gaze was locked on Marcus, searching, probing, running a diagnostic on 15 years of friendship. He saw the flicker of a micro-expression in Marcus's eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but a sudden, sharp wariness. It was the look of a man realizing the conversation had just entered uncharted territory. Okay, Marcus said slowly, taking a half step back, creating a buffer of space. So what does it say? Emmett watched him. Every instinct, every finely honed sense that had helped him gut his competitors and build his empire, was screaming. He didn't uncurl his fist. He didn't share the contents. Information was leverage. He had just received the most valuable piece of intelligence in his life, and he wasn't about to give it away. It says enough, Emmett said, the words clipped and cold. Where were you last August, Marcus? The second week. The question hung in the opulent air between them. Marcus blinked. The easygoing charm vanished, replaced by a mask of professional composure. August? I was in San Jose, handling the fallout from the DDoS attack while you were in Seoul. You know that. I was putting out fires 24/7. All of the second week, Emmett pressed. No family emergency? The color drained from Marcus's face. It was almost imperceptible, but Emmett, whose life was built on noticing the details others missed, saw it clearly. The slight tightening around his jaw, the way his eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second before meeting Emmett's again. My sister had a health scare, Marcus said, his voice a little too firm. I had to fly to Boston for 2 days. I told you about it when you got back. It was nothing. Jay, what the hell is this about? You're 5 minutes from getting married. 2 days, Boston. It was a plausible, well-rehearsed lie. But the note said Lake Como, and the look in Marcus's eyes said he was hiding something. Emmett's mind was a whirlwind. He needed verification. He needed proof. The note was an accusation, not a conviction. But to walk down that aisle now would be an act of willful blindness, an unforgivable betrayal of himself and everything he had built. He strode past Marcus, yanking open the door of the suite. A harried-looking wedding planner, clipboard in hand, nearly collided with him. Mr. Rowe, it's time. The music is about to start, she chirped, her smile plastered on. Stop the music, Emmett commanded. The planner's smile faltered. I beg your pardon? You heard me. Stop everything. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved down the grand carpeted hallway, his long strides eating up the distance. He could hear Marcus calling his name behind him, a note of panic now coloring his voice. Emmett, wait. Let's just talk about this. Don't do anything rash. Guests were peeking out of doorways, their champagne flutes paused midair, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The joyous hum had been replaced by a tense, confused silence. Emmett ignored them. He had a singular focus. Lila. He found her in the bridal suite at the opposite end of the hall. The door was ajar, and the sound of her light, silvery laughter spilled out. He pushed it open. The scene was a tableau of bridal perfection. Lila was a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown, a cascade of silk and lace that seemed to glow from within. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and diamonds glittered at her throat. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all cooing and fussing over her. She was looking at her reflection, and the smile on her face was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. Then she saw him in the mirror. The smile froze. The triumph in her eyes was instantly replaced by a carefully constructed mask of loving concern. Emmett, darling, it's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, she said, her voice like honey. Her bridesmaids scurried out of the room, sensing the storm clouds gathering. Emmett walked into the center of the room, stopping a few feet from her. He could smell her perfume, the same expensive scent she'd worn on their first date. It suddenly smelled cloying, dishonest. We need to talk, he said. Now? She laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. Darling, we have our entire lives to talk. The guests are waiting. They can wait, he said, his voice flat. He raised the hand holding the crumpled note. I have a question for you, Lila. A simple one. She tilted her head, a portrait of innocence. Anything. Lake Como, he said. Last August. Every ounce of color drained from her face. It was a more dramatic, more telling reaction than even Marcus had given. Her mask of perfection didn't just crack, it shattered. In her wide, terrified eyes, Emmett saw the truth. He didn't even need to ask the second question. He already knew the answer. She stammered, her hands clutching the priceless fabric of her dress. Lake Como? My trip with the girls. Who were you with, Lila? He pressed, his voice dangerously quiet. What were their names? Show me the pictures, not the selfies. The ones with your friends. She had no answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He saw the panic, the frantic search for a plausible lie, the dawning horror that the game was up. Behind him, Marcus appeared in the doorway, breathless. Emmett, for God's sake, this is insane. You're destroying your own wedding over some anonymous, malicious note. Emmett turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the crumbling bride to the panicked best man. The two of them, framed in the doorway, their lies exposed and hanging in the air between them. It was a grotesque parody of the life he thought he was building. He gave a short, harsh laugh. It was a terrible sound, full of broken trust and chilling clarity. My wedding? He said, his voice dripping with ice. There is no wedding. He looked back at Lila, at the beautiful, perfect stranger in the white dress. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, but they didn't move him. They were just another part of the performance. It's over, he said, and with that, he turned his back on his bride, on his best friend, on the wreckage of their lives. He walked out of the room, past the stunned face of the wedding planner, down the grand hall lined with the shocked faces of his guests. He didn't run. He walked with the cold, deliberate purpose of a man who had just raised his own life to the ground to save its foundation. He walked out of the mansion into the perfect California sun and never looked back. The $1 million wedding was over before it had even begun. The silence Emmett left in his wake was more explosive than any shout. In the bridal suite, Lila Montgomery finally crumpled, the structural integrity of her poise giving way. The Vera Wang gown, worth more than the average American's annual salary, pooled around her as she sank onto a velvet chaise lounge, her sobs ugly and real. They weren't the delicate, cinematic tears he was used to. They were the guttural sounds of a carefully constructed world imploding. Marcus rushed to her side, his own panic momentarily forgotten. Lila, get it together, he hissed, his voice a low, urgent whisper. People are out there. The media will be all over this. We need a story. The story is over, she wailed, her mascara tracing black rivers down her pale cheeks. He knows. Marcus, he knows everything. He knows nothing. Marcus snapped, his easygoing facade completely gone, replaced by the ruthless pragmatist Emmett knew from hostile takeover bids. He has a note, a piece of paper. It's hearsay, anonymous slander. We can fight this. We just need to get our story straight. What story? Lila looked up at him, her eyes wild with desperation. That you just happened to be in Lake Como at the same time I was? That your family emergency in Boston was a transatlantic flight to Italy? He's not an idiot, Marcus. He's Emmett Rowe. He'll have our flight records, hotel receipts, and the DNA of the damn bed sheets before sunset. She was right. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through Marcus's veins. Emmett wasn't just a rich man. He was a data-driven predator. His mind didn't work like other people's. He saw patterns, connections, and vulnerabilities. Right now, he would be seeing them everywhere. Downstairs, chaos was blooming. The wedding planner, a formidable woman named Genevieve, was attempting to maintain order, but it was like trying to dam a tsunami with a teaspoon. Her voice, strained and high-pitched, cut through the confused murmurs. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, there appears to be a slight, unforeseen delay. Please enjoy the champagne and canapes. The ceremony will commence shortly. But the guests weren't buying it. The sight of the groom striding out of his own wedding without a word was an image that couldn't be unseen. Phones were already out. Thumbs were flying across screens, sending hushed, speculative texts. The news was spreading through the crowd like a virus. I saw his face. It was like thunder. Walked right past her mother without a glance. Did you see Lila's bridesmaids? They looked terrified. The first to break rank was a reporter from a tech gossip blog, a piranha named Chloe Montgomery, no relation to Lila, a fact she always found irritating, who had finagled an invitation. She slipped out a side door, her phone pressed to her ear, dictating the story that would break the internet within the hour. Headline: Billionaire groom Emmett Rowe bails on his own wedding. Get it up now. I have an inside source who says the bride is in hysterics. Something about the best man. Yes, Marcus Thorne. This is huge. Emmett, meanwhile, was already in the back of his waiting Maybach, the one meant for his triumphant departure with his new wife. Get me out of here, David, he said to his driver, his voice devoid of all emotion. To the reception, sir? The driver asked, confused. To the office, Emmett commanded, and get my lawyer on the phone. Now, and then get me Sarah Jenkins. Sarah Jenkins was the head of his personal security team, a former Mossad agent who could find a whisper in a hurricane. If anyone could verify the details of the note and uncover its source, it was her. As the car pulled away, shielded by tinted glass, Emmett finally uncurled his fist. He smoothed the crumpled note onto his knee. The neat, elegant script seemed to mock him. Who had written it? Who had access to his private suite, to his grandfather's cufflink box? Who knew about Lake Como, Marcus, and the prenup clauses? It was someone on the inside. Someone who wanted to stop the wedding, but also wanted to expose a deeper conspiracy. His mind, now free from the emotional shock, began to do what it did best: analyze, strategize, and plan a counterattack. The personal betrayal was a gaping wound, but the mention of the prenup meant this was also a corporate assault, an attack on Rowe Innovations itself. Lila and Marcus hadn't just been planning an affair, they had been planning a heist, using the sacred vow of marriage as their weapon. The IP clauses were the key. If he had married her, any new patent, any new algorithm, any breakthrough conceived during their marriage could have been claimed as joint property in a subsequent divorce. A divorce that, he now realized, was likely planned from the very beginning. They would have bled him dry, legally and brilliantly. The betrayal was so profound, so multi-layered, it was almost a work of art. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Daniel Levin. Emmett, what in God's name is going on? I'm getting calls from reporters, from the wedding planners. The wedding is off, Daniel, Emmett said calmly. I'm on my way to the office. I want you to file an emergency injunction against Marcus Thorne. Freeze his access to all company accounts, servers, and intellectual property, effective immediately. Cite gross misconduct and potential corporate espionage. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Marcus? Emmett, are you sure? You need grounds for... I have grounds, Emmett cut in, his voice like steel. And get our litigation team ready. I want a full audit of every transaction Marcus has approved in the last 6 months. And I want to review my prenup with Lila Montgomery, specifically the IP clauses her lawyer pushed for. He hung up, his instructions delivered. This was his world. Not the world of flowers and vows, but the world of strategy, leverage, and consequences. The pain was still there, a hot, agonizing core in his chest. But around it, the ice was forming. The cold, calculating fury that had made him a billionaire was taking over. He had been played. He, Emmett Rowe, the man who saw every angle, had been made a fool of. He had mistaken a predator for a partner. He had mistaken a viper for a friend. The wedding might be over, but the war had just begun. The Rowe Innovations headquarters in San Francisco was a monument to Emmett's mind, a sleek 20-story tower of black glass and steel that hummed with quiet, relentless efficiency. While the world was feasting on the salacious gossip of his aborted wedding, Emmett was in his element. The penthouse office, usually a pristine space with panoramic views of the bay, was now a war room. Daniel Levin, his lawyer, was pacing, his phone buzzing incessantly. Sarah Jenkins, his head of security, stood silently by the window, her presence as calming as it was intimidating. She was a woman of few words and decisive action. "The injunction is filed," Daniel said, finally ending a call. "Marcus is locked out. The board is in an uproar. They're demanding an emergency meeting." "They'll get one." "When I'm ready," Emmett said, not looking up from his monitor. He was staring at a photograph, one of the few he had from the Lake Como trip. Lila smiling on a balcony, a turquoise lake behind her. He had always thought she looked lonely. Now he realized she was just cropping someone out of the frame. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "The note. I need to know who wrote it." Sarah stepped forward. "The stationery is custom, from a boutique in Mayfair, London. Very expensive, no watermark. The handwriting is professional, likely from a calligrapher, to make it untraceable. The delivery is the key. You said it was placed in your cufflink box between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. on the wedding day." "Correct." During that window, Sarah continued, consulting a tablet. 27 people had access to the master suite corridor. That includes mansion staff, the wedding planners, florists, your tailor, and the immediate wedding party. "We're pulling security footage from the mansion, but the corridor itself is a blind spot, a deliberate choice by the hotel for guest privacy." "Convenient," Emmett muttered. "So anyone could have paid a staff member to place it?" "Or walked in themselves," Sarah countered. "The person who wrote this is intelligent. They knew your personal history with those cufflinks. They knew it was a place you would look, and a place no one else would touch. They knew the details of the affair and the intricacies of the prenup. This isn't just an angry ex-lover, Emmett. This is someone with a deep, intimate knowledge of your personal and professional life." The circle of suspects was small and terrifyingly close. Emmett's phone buzzed. It was a secure message from a contact at a credit card processing company, a favor he was calling in. He opened it. It was a list of transactions from a corporate card Marcus controlled. Emmett scanned the list, his eyes narrowing. Flights, hotels, dinners. And there it was. August 11th. A charge for €8,000. Villa d'Esto, Lake Como. The confirmation was a punch to the gut, even though he'd expected it. But below it was something he hadn't expected. Another charge on the same day, from the same hotel. A spa treatment for two, booked under the name Thorne. But there was a third charge that made him pause. A cash withdrawal. €50,000 from a bank in Lugano, Switzerland, just across the border. What did Marcus need with that much cash on a romantic getaway? "Find out what else Marcus did in Italy," Emmett said to Sarah. "I want to know who he met with, who he talked to, especially in Switzerland." While Sarah began tapping commands into her tablet, Emmett turned his attention to the prenup. Daniel had it displayed on the large screen on the wall, the dense legal text a stark contrast to the wedding photos that had been there just hours ago. "The IP clauses," Emmett said. "Article 9, Section C." Daniel highlighted the section. "As we discussed, it's aggressive. It assigns 50% ownership of any conceptual or realized intellectual property developed by either party during the term of the marriage to the marital estate." "My lawyer said it was unusual, but not a deal-breaker," Emmett said, disgust lacing his voice. "At the time, we assumed it was posturing by her family's legal team," Daniel admitted, looking chagrined. "We viewed it through the lens of a typical high-net-worth divorce. We inserted counter clauses to protect existing Rowe Innovations EP. We didn't anticipate this. We didn't anticipate it being part of a coordinated corporate attack." With my own CFO, Emmett finished for him. The pieces were slotting together with sickening precision. Marcus, as CFO, knew exactly which projects were in the pipeline. He knew about Project Chimera, Emmett's secret next-generation compression algorithm that wasn't even on the books yet. It existed only in Emmett's mind and in encrypted fragments on his personal server. If he had married Lila, Marcus could have fed her just enough information about Chimera for her to claim conceptual contribution. In a divorce, she would have walked away with half of the most valuable technology he had ever created, with Marcus ready to help her monetize it. They would have gutted Rowe Innovations from the inside out. "This is more than an affair," Emmett said, the full scope of the betrayal settling upon him. "This was a long-term plan to steal my life's work." A new message alert popped up on his screen. It was from Sarah. It contained a single file, a grainy security camera still. The timestamp was from last August, from the lobby of a private bank in Lugano, Switzerland. It showed Marcus Thorne shaking hands with another man. Emmett zoomed in. The man was older, with slicked-back silver hair and a cruel, thin-lipped smile. Emmett felt a jolt of recognition, followed by a wave of cold fury. It was Nikolai Volkov, a ruthless Russian oligarch and a corporate raider, notorious for hostile takeovers and asset stripping. He was also the primary investor behind their biggest competitor, Centec. The €50,000 withdrawal wasn't for a shopping spree, it was a payment, or a down payment. Marcus wasn't just cheating with his fiancée, he was colluding with his greatest enemy. He was a traitor. The anonymous note had not been an act of vengeance. It had been a warning. But who would know about Volkov's involvement? Who would be privy to a secret meeting in Switzerland? Volkov was famously paranoid. The circle of people who knew about this meeting would be infinitesimally small. Emmett stared at the image of Marcus shaking hands with the devil, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a new, more horrifying picture. He had been looking for a jilted lover or a disgruntled employee. He had been looking for a simple motive, like greed or jealousy, but this was infinitely more complex. He had a digital ghost in his life, someone who could see everything, from the secrets of his bedroom to the secrets of his boardroom. And that ghost had just saved him. But why? What was their endgame? Saving Emmett Rowe didn't seem like something that would benefit a man like Nikolai Volkov, unless the ghost wasn't trying to save him at all, unless they were just using him as a weapon to take out Marcus and Lila for their own reasons. Emmett stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights. He had been playing checkers, thinking it was a game of love and betrayal, but the real players were playing three-dimensional chess on a global scale, and he had just been moved from a pawn to a king, whether he liked it or not. The name Nikolai Volkov changed the entire equation. This was no longer a domestic drama. It was corporate warfare. Emmett's pain, a raw, personal agony, was now encased in a shell of cold, strategic fury. He had built his company to be a fortress. Now he knew the traitor had not been at the gates, but in the throne room beside him. His first move was surgical. Within an hour, a team of forensic accountants, led by Sarah Jenkins, descended upon Marcus Thorne's digital life. They had the injunction giving them legal right to access every file, every email, every transaction associated with his role as CFO. His second move was to go dark. He switched to a burner phone and had his Maybach swapped for a nondescript black sedan. The media was in a frenzy, camped outside his office, his home, and the now infamous Greystone Mansion. He refused to give them a single soundbite. He would not be the jilted groom. He would be the silent hunter. His third and most crucial move was to summon Lila Montgomery, not to his office, not to his home. He sent a car for her, a simple Uber, not one of his fleet, with a message giving her an address in Sausalito. It was a small, unassuming law office, one he kept on retainer for discreet matters, miles away from the prying eyes of the press. He knew she would come. Her perfect life was in ashes, and her co-conspirator was incommunicado. She was cornered, and cornered people make mistakes. She arrived looking like a ghost of the bride she was meant to be. The couture dress was gone, replaced by simple black trousers and a silk blouse. Her face was pale and stripped of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked broken. Emmett felt a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a memory of the woman he thought he loved, but he extinguished it. Sentiment was a liability he could no longer afford. They sat in a sterile conference room, a mahogany table between them. Daniel Levin sat beside Emmett, a silent, imposing presence. "No lawyers, Lila?" Emmett began, his voice calm. She shook her head, clutching a leather handbag in her lap like a shield. "My family's lawyer, he's not answering my calls. I think you already got to him." "We simply reminded him of the legal definition of conspiracy to commit fraud," Daniel said smoothly. "He's chosen to protect his firm wisely." Lila flinched. "What do you want, Emmett?" "I want the truth," he said, leaning forward. "All of it. Not the lies you tell the media, not the story you and Marcus concocted. The real story. You do this, and you might walk away from this with something more than a lawsuit that will bankrupt your family for generations. You lie to me, Lila, and I will spend the next 10 years of my life making sure you become a cautionary tale." Her composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "You wanted to gut me," he countered, his voice like ice. "You wanted to take my company, my future, my life's work. So let's skip the apologies and get to the facts. It started with Marcus, didn't it?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yes, a long time ago. Before you and I were even serious. It was a mistake, a one-time thing, but he never let me forget it. Blackmail, the oldest play in the book." "He held it over you," Emmett stated. "He was my friend," she sobbed. "And then he was a monster. When you and I got engaged, he saw his opportunity. He said we were perfect, that we could do it together. He said you were ruthless, that you'd discard me eventually anyway, and that this was my only way to secure my future. My family, we lost everything in the 2008 crash. Marcus knew that. He preyed on it. The picture was becoming clearer. Lila wasn't the mastermind. She was the tool, a deeply flawed, willing, but ultimately disposable tool. And the prenup, Emmett pressed? The IP clauses? They were Marcus's idea, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He drafted them with my lawyer. He said they were standard for a tech marriage to protect my intellectual contributions. He coached me on how to present them to you. He knew you'd be exhausted from the Seoul trip. He knew you wanted to keep me happy. He planned the timing perfectly. And Lake Como? She winced, the name a fresh wound. He said we had to meet someone, a final investor for our plan. He said it had to be out of the country, somewhere discreet. Nikolai Volkov, Emmett said. The name dropped into the room like a block of granite. Lila's head shot up, her eyes wide with genuine shock and fear. How do you know that name? He's the man you met in Switzerland, isn't he? She began to tremble. Yes. Marcus took me to a bank across the border. This man, he was terrifying. He didn't speak to me. He just looked at me like I was an asset he was purchasing. He and Marcus talked in Russian. Then Marcus came back with a briefcase full of money. He said it was seed capital for our new life. This was the twist Emmett hadn't anticipated. Volkov wasn't just an investor in their scheme. He was an active participant, but it still didn't make sense. Why would Volkov, who wanted to destroy Roe Innovations, sanction a plan and then send a note to blow it up? One last question, Lila, Emmett said, his eyes boring into hers. The note, the one that was left in my room. Did you write it? She looked genuinely bewildered. The note? No, I thought you found out some other way. I thought one of my bridesmaids talked. I never saw any note. He believed her. Her terror was too real, her confusion too authentic. She was an accomplice, but she wasn't the ghost. The ghost was still out there, playing a different game entirely. Then who, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Who else knew everything? Suddenly a thought struck him, a loose thread he hadn't pulled. The calligrapher. The note was written by a professional to be untraceable, but a professional is still a person who gets paid. He looked at Sarah Jenkins, who had just entered the room and was standing by the door. Sarah, he said, a new urgency in his voice, the payment to the calligrapher. We assumed it was cash. What if it wasn't? What if our ghost made a mistake? Sarah nodded, already on her tablet, pulling every low-value transaction from all known accounts associated with Volkov, Zentech, and Marcus Thorne for the last month. Looking for payments to graphic artists, stationers, calligraphers. They waited in silence, the only sound the soft tapping of Sarah's fingers on the screen. Lila sat frozen, a spectator to the unraveling of a conspiracy far deeper than she had ever imagined. Then Sarah's fingers stopped. I have it, she said, her voice tight. A payment for £500, made 3 weeks ago, from a shell corporation. But the shell is funded by a single source. Who? Emmett demanded. Sarah looked up from the tablet, her expression grim. The Marcus Thorne Family Trust. Emmett stared at her, confused. Marcus? Marcus paid to have a note written that would expose his own plan? That makes no sense. The payment wasn't authorized by Marcus, Sarah said, swiping on the screen. The trust requires two signatories for any non-investment expenditure. The payment was authorized by the second signatory, his sister, Marcus's sister, the family emergency in Boston. The alibi. What's her name? Emmett asked. Lillian Thorne, Sarah replied. And according to this, she's not in Boston. She's a lead engineer at Zentech, Volkov's company. The air left the room. It wasn't Marcus and Lila versus Emmett. It wasn't even Volkov using Marcus to get to Emmett. It was something else. A tangled, venomous knot of family loyalty, corporate espionage, and betrayal. The ghost had a name, and she was a traitor's sister. Lillian Thorne. The name echoed in the silence of the war room. It was the master key, the missing variable that made the entire insane equation balance. Emmett felt a strange sense of vertigo. He had been so focused on the faces of the conspirators in front of him, Lila, Marcus, Volkov, that he had failed to see the architect pulling the strings from the shadows. Lillian Thorne, he repeated, letting the name settle. Lead engineer at our biggest rival, sister of my CFO, and she sends a warning that blows up her own brother's multi-million-dollar scheme. Why? Daniel Levin, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. Sibling rivalry? A crisis of conscience? No, Emmett said, shaking his head. This wasn't an emotional act. The note was too precise. The timing, the delivery, the content, it was a strategic move. She didn't want to save me. She wanted to eliminate Marcus. Sarah Jenkins pulled up a file on the main screen. It was a personnel and psych profile of Lillian Thorne. Photos showed a woman with the same blonde hair as Marcus, but where his eyes were full of easy charm, hers were sharp, intelligent, and cold. Top of her class at MIT, recruited by Zentech straight out of grad school, a reputation for being brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. She and Marcus were close, Sarah reported, scanning the file. But there was a falling out 5 years ago, something to do with their family estate after their father passed. Marcus, as the son, got controlling interest in the family trust. Lillian contested it, but lost. According to these notes, she felt cheated, that he had manipulated their father. The motive clicked into place, cold and sharp as an icicle. It was about inheritance, power, revenge. She knew Marcus was working with Volkov. Emmett pieced it together, his voice low and intense. She works for Volkov. She probably even facilitated the initial connection. She helped her brother build his golden parachute, so she could be the one to set it on fire, Daniel finished, his eyes wide with dawning understanding. She used me, Emmett said. The realization was chilling. She used my wedding as a stage. She knew Marcus was vulnerable, overconfident. She planted the note knowing I would react exactly as I did. I was her weapon. I would do the dirty work of exposing Marcus and Lila, disgracing them publicly and legally. And in doing so, Sarah added, you would trigger the gross misconduct clauses in the Thorne family trust. With Marcus facing federal charges for conspiracy and fraud, control of the trust and the entire family fortune would revert to the only other signatory, her. It was a breathtakingly cynical plan, a masterpiece of familial betrayal. Lillian had played them all. She had sacrificed her brother to seize their family's wealth, and in the process, crippled the leadership of her employer's main competitor by taking out its CFO. She won on all fronts. Emmett looked at the screen, at the cold, intelligent face of Lillian Thorne. He felt a sliver of grudging respect for the sheer audacity of her plan. She was an opponent worthy of his attention. Where is Marcus now? Emmett asked. He's holed up in his penthouse apartment, Sarah replied. He hasn't left. He knows he's being watched. He's trying to get a message to Volkov, but we've jammed his secure comms. And Lillian? She's in San Francisco. She flew in from London 2 days before the wedding. She's staying at the Four Seasons. She wanted a front row seat to watch the fireworks, Emmett muttered. He stood up. Get the car ready. Where are you going? Daniel asked, alarmed. You can't confront her, Emmett. Let the authorities handle this. The authorities can have Marcus, Emmett said, his eyes glinting with a hard light. Volkov is untouchable in Russia. Lila is a pawn I've already broken. But Lillian is the architect. She built this whole damn thing. She owes me a conversation. The confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom or a law office. Emmett had Sarah arrange for Lillian to be picked up, using the pretense that Nikolai Volkov was summoning her. She was brought not to a hotel, but to a private hangar at the Oakland airport, where Emmett's jet sat waiting, a sleek silver Predator on the tarmac. Lillian Thorne walked into the hangar, her expression confident, expectant. When she saw Emmett standing there instead of Volkov, her composure didn't crack, but a flicker of surprise registered in her cold eyes. "Emmett Rowe," she said, her voice smooth and even. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. I have to say, I'm impressed. It took you longer than I expected, but you got there." There was no pretense, no denial. It was a frank admission between two apex predators. "The note," Emmett said, getting straight to the point. "That was you." "A wedding gift," she replied with a thin smile. "Consider how much I saved you. A messy divorce, half your intellectual property. You should be thanking me." "You used me to destroy your own brother," Emmett stated. "My brother was a fool," Lillian shot back, her voice suddenly laced with venom. "He was greedy and reckless. He embezzled from our family trust for years. He colluded with our father's biggest rival. He was a stain on our family name. I simply cleaned house. You were just a convenient and very effective tool for the job." "And what about Volkov?" Emmett asked. "Does he know that his lead engineer just sabotaged his plan to gut his biggest competitor?" Lillian laughed, a genuine sharp sound. "Volkov doesn't care about Marcus or your little fiancé. He cares about disruption, chaos. You think this was a failure for him? Look at you. Your company is in turmoil. Your CFO is about to be indicted. Your personal life is a public spectacle. Zentech's stock is up 8% this morning on news of your instability. Volkov didn't lose. He just won in a different way than he expected. And I delivered that win for him." She was right. In the grand chess game, she had checkmated everyone. "So you get it all," Emmett said, his voice quiet. "The family fortune, a promotion from Volkov, your brother's ruin. Justice," she corrected him. "It's not about the money, Emmett. It's about what's right. Marcus stole my birthright. I simply took it back. With interest." Emmett stared at her, this woman who had orchestrated everything. He had come here expecting to feel rage, a desire for revenge. Instead, he felt a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was surrounded by people who saw life as a zero-sum game of power and acquisition. Lila, Marcus, Lillian, Volkov, they were all just different versions of the same predator. And for a moment, looking at Lillian's cold, triumphant face, he wondered if he was any different. He had built his fortress of glass and steel to protect himself from the world, but the poison had been inside all along. "There's just one thing you didn't count on," Emmett said finally. Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what's that?" "The note was written on stationery from Mayfair, but you paid for it from the family trust, a US-based account. That's wire fraud. And since you used that act to manipulate the stock market in Zentech's favor, that's securities fraud too. You may have outplayed your brother, Lillian, but I'm not your brother." He gestured to the shadows of the hangar. Two FBI agents stepped forward. Lillian's smile finally vanished. The color drained from her face as she looked from the agents to Emmett. The supreme confidence in her eyes was replaced by the one thing she had not anticipated: defeat. She had planned for everything except the one man who was as ruthless and meticulous as she was. The arrests of Marcus and Lillian Thorne sent shockwaves through the financial and tech worlds, eclipsing the gossip of the failed wedding. The story became a sprawling epic of corporate espionage and familial betrayal. Marcus, faced with a mountain of evidence and Lila's full confession, was swiftly convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, losing the freedom and fortune he had schemed to protect. Lillian's fight was fiercer, backed by Zentech's legal army, but Emmett's meticulous case prevailed. She was convicted of fraud, receiving a 5-year sentence and losing control of the family trust she'd murdered her relationship with her brother for. Her grand victory had turned to ash. Lila Montgomery, by cooperating fully, avoided prosecution. Emmett, in a final, quiet act, ensured her family's debts were settled. It wasn't forgiveness, but severance, cutting the last tie. She disappeared from the public eye, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. As for Emmett Rowe, he emerged from the wreckage a changed man. He threw himself into his work with terrifying focus, and Rowe Innovations soared to unprecedented success. Emmett had won by every conceivable metric, yet the victory felt hollow. His penthouse office was an observation deck for a world he was no longer a part of. Trust, the only currency his grandfather valued, was one he no longer traded in. He was richer, more powerful, and utterly alone. About a year later, a sleepless night led him to the security logs from the wedding day. He watched the blur of faces until one stopped him. A cleaning lady, an older woman with a tired face, pushing a service cart. He watched her pause, look both ways, and carefully slide the small white envelope under his door. Sarah Jenkins identified her as Maria Flores, a widow with a son struggling to pay his tuition at UC Berkeley. He kept digging, chasing a hunch until he found the final piece of the puzzle, a single anonymous donation of $100,000 to the son's scholarship fund. It was routed through a labyrinth of digital misdirection, but Emmett navigated it back to the source account. It was his own. Daniel Levin had made the payment. He called it a loose end. The woman, paid by Lillian for the delivery, had come to Daniel terrified she'd be implicated. Seeing an opportunity for both a key witness and an act of quiet decency, Daniel had made a deal. Her silence in exchange for her son's future. Emmett leaned back, the city lights blurring below. He had thought the story was about grand betrayals between titans, but perhaps it had always been about the smaller things. A son's future, a lawyer's compassion, a grandfather's wisdom. For the first time in a year, the ice around his heart seemed to thaw. He picked up his phone and called Daniel. "The Maria Flores file," Emmett said simply. "I know." There was a long pause. "It was the right thing to do," Daniel said finally. "I know," Emmett repeated. "The fortress didn't need to come down, but perhaps it was time to build a gate." In the end, it wasn't a story about a wedding. It was a story about value. The value of a company, the value of a promise, and the impossible price of trust. Emmett Rowe won his war, but the victory came at the cost of his own heart, leaving him isolated in the very empire he fought so hard to protect. It's a chilling reminder that the deepest betrayals often come from those standing closest to us, and the most intricate traps are the ones we willingly walk into. What do you think? Was Lillian Thorne a monster or a master strategist? Who was the real victim in this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of shattered trust and shocking revelations kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good drama, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more true stories that are stranger than fiction. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update.
The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art dripped light onto the city's elite, a silent witness to 1,000 whispered secrets. But tonight, one secret was about to be screamed. At the center of it all stood Damian Blackwood, a titan of industry whose smile could seal $1 billion deal, and his wife Eleonora, the epitome of grace and old-world elegance. To the world, they were a power couple, a dynasty in the making. But as Damian tapped his champagne glass for silence, the beautiful facade of their life was about to be shattered, proving that the most brutal betrayals don't happen in the boardroom. They happen in the heart under the blinding glare of public adoration. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming peonies. Eleonora Vance Blackwood, known to her friends as Nora, stood beside her husband, a practiced smile gracing her lips. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the light, a perfect complement to the legendary Vance family emeralds that graced her neck. For 10 years she had played this part, the perfect wife to the self-made billionaire, Damien Blackwood. She was the old money Polish to his new money ambition, the quiet grace that tempered his ruthless edge. Their life was a meticulously curated masterpiece. A penthouse on Park Avenue overlooking Central Park, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a private jet on permanent standby. But within the gilded cage, the gold had begun to rust. The silence in their vast, sterile apartment was deafening, broken only by the ticking of antique clocks and the unspoken weight of Nora's failure. After a decade of trying of invasive procedures and heartbreaking disappointments, there was still no heir. For a man like Damien, who viewed everything including his marriage as a legacy-building enterprise, this was the ultimate flaw in his otherwise perfect acquisition. "Darling." Damien's voice was a low murmur, his hand a possessive weight on the small of her back. "You look breathtaking tonight." It was the same compliment he gave her at every event, delivered with the same detached sincerity. "Thank you, Damien," she replied, her voice a soft melody that belied the tremor in her heart. He leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive scotch. "Big announcement tonight. The Blackwood Foundation is doubling its endowment for the new pediatric wing. Make sure you look suitably proud." She nodded, the emeralds cool against her skin. It was always about the performance, the public perception. Later, as the applause for his generous donation subsided, Damien raised his glass again. "And on a more personal note," he began, his voice booming with false warmth, his eyes scanning the crowd of New York's most powerful people. He didn't look at Nora. "This has been a year of incredible growth for Blackwood Global. But real growth, true legacy, is about the future. It's about the next generation." A nervous titter went through the crowd. Nora's smile felt frozen on her face. What was he doing? Damien's gaze finally fell upon a young woman standing near the stage. Chloe Sterling, a brilliant raven-haired VP in his acquisitions department, known for her killer instinct and ambition that mirrored Damien's own. She was glowing, her hand resting almost imperceptibly on her stomach. Nora's blood ran cold. "And so," Damien continued, his voice resonating with triumph, "it is with immense joy that I share some personal news. Chloe and I are expecting a child, a son." The silence was absolute, a sonic boom of shock that sucked all the air from the room. 100 pairs of eyes darted from Damien to Chloe, and then with a kind of horrified pity to Nora. The emeralds on her neck suddenly felt like a hangman's noose. Her husband had just publicly executed their marriage. He finally turned to her, his eyes not apologetic, but cold, hard, and final. It was a business decision. She was a failed asset being liquidated. "Eleonora and I have decided to separate," he announced, the lie as audacious as the truth. "We wish each other the best in our future endeavors." The world tilted on its axis. The whispers started a venomous tide rising to drown her. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the morbid curiosity. She stood there, a statue of public humiliation, while her husband, the man she had loved, stood beaming beside his pregnant mistress. She didn't run. She didn't cry. An unnatural calm settled over her. With a grace she didn't know she possessed, she lifted her chin, met the pitying stare of her oldest friend, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she turned and walked, not ran through the parting sea of guests. Each step was deliberate, her back ramrod straight. She walked out of the ballroom, out of the museum, and out of the life that had just been so spectacularly detonated, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of a 10-year lie. The cold night air hit her face, a welcome shock of reality. As a taxi pulled to the curb, a single silent tear finally traced a path down her cheek. The performance was over. The Park Avenue penthouse felt like a mausoleum. The minimalist decor, once chic and sophisticated, now seemed cold and alien. Every object, from the Jeff Koons sculpture in the foyer to the cashmere throws on the sofa, was a testament to a life that was no longer hers. Damien hadn't come home. He had sent a messenger instead, a junior lawyer from his firm, a young man with a nervous tic and a briefcase full of dissolution papers. The terms were as brutal as they were efficient. The prenuptial agreement, which Nora had signed without a second thought a decade ago, was ironclad. She would receive a one-time settlement, generous by any normal standard, but a pittance compared to the Blackwood fortune. She was to vacate the penthouse within 48 hours. A non-disclosure agreement, thick as a novel, accompanied the divorce papers, gagging her for life. She signed everything without reading. What was the point? Damien's message was clear. You are erased, her maid Maria. A kind woman who had been with her for years helped her pack a single suitcase with tears in her eyes. Nora moved with a numb, robotic efficiency, taking only her personal effects, her books, and a small framed photo of her parents on their wedding day. She left the designer clothes, the jewelry, save for a simple gold locket from her grandmother and the hollow shell of her identity as Mrs. Blackwood. She didn't go to a hotel. She didn't call her society friends who were no doubt feasting on the gossip. Instead, she directed the taxi to a quiet, tree-lined street in the West Village, to a handsome brownstone she hadn't set foot in for nearly 5 years. She paid the driver and walked up the steps, the iron railing cold beneath her hand. She rang the bell, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The door was opened by a man in his late 60s with a shock of silver hair and eyes the same shade of emerald green as the now abandoned necklace. Arthur Vance looked at his daughter, his face a mask of concern etched with the deep lines of a forgotten sorrow. "Nora," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "Hello, Father," she whispered, and then the dam of her composure broke. She collapsed into his arms, the sobs she had suppressed for days racking her body. Arthur held her, patting her back as he had when she was a little girl who'd scraped her knee. He led her inside, away from the prying eyes of the world. The house was filled with books, the scent of old paper and lemon polish, a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. This was the home of her childhood, a world away from Damien's sterile palaces of glass and steel. Arthur Vance was a scholar, a man of intellect and integrity, whose family had been a cornerstone of New York society for generations. He had disapproved of Damien from the start, seeing the rapacious hunger behind the younger man's charm. Damien, in turn, had viewed Arthur as a relic, a dinosaur from a bygone era. The rift between father and daughter had grown when Nora chose Damien's world over her own, culminating in a bitter argument years ago that had resulted in this pained silence. For hours, Nora recounted the entire story, the years of quiet desperation, the emotional neglect, the final public humiliation. Arthur listened without interruption, his expression hardening with a quiet fury. He was my mentee, Arthur said, his voice laced with a bitterness Nora had never heard before. I brought him into the firm. I introduced him to investors. He built his empire on the foundations I helped him lay, and then he pushed me out. I thought he was just ruthless in business. I never imagined his cruelty extended so deeply into his heart. He wanted an heir, Father, Nora said, her voice hollow. It was all he ever talked about. A legacy. a son to carry the Blackwood name. And he discarded you like a barren mare. Arthur spat the venom in his words, startling her. Nora looked down at her hands, twisting the simple gold band on her finger, a ring she would soon no longer have the right to wear. She took a deep, shuddering breath, summoning the courage for her own revelation. The one secret she had been holding close to her chest, a fragile, terrifying hope. "That's the thing, Father," she said, looking up, her eyes meeting his. "The irony is almost too cruel to bear." She placed a trembling hand on her own stomach, the same spot where she had seen Chloe Sterling rest her hand in triumph. "I went to the doctor last week for a routine checkup before starting another round of treatments. The final round, I'd decided." Her voice broke. "The tests came back yesterday morning, the day of the gala." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hope and dread all mingling at once. "Father," Nora whispered, a single tear of an entirely different emotion sliding down her cheek. "I'm pregnant. 10 weeks. The secret was out, not in a triumphant announcement under the chandeliers of the Met, but in the quiet, dusty study of her estranged father. It wasn't a weapon, not yet. It was a terrifying, precious, and life-altering truth. The heir, Damien Blackwood, had so desperately craved the legacy he had destroyed his marriage for, was the one thing he had just unwittingly thrown away. The following weeks were a blur of quiet consolidation. Nora moved into a guest room in her father's brownstone, a cozy space filled with forgotten childhood books and faded floral wallpaper. The anonymity of the West Village was a sanctuary. Here she wasn't the disgraced wife of a billionaire. She was simply Arthur Vance's daughter. The initial shock gave way to a steely resolve, an emotion she hadn't felt in years. It was fueled by a mother's primal need to protect her unborn child. She knew Damien could not find out about the pregnancy. Not yet. He would use it, twist it, turn it into another battleground. He would claim she was lying, or worse, he would try to take the child. Her child would not be a pawn in the Blackwood legacy game. "He won't just let you go, you know," Arthur said one evening as they sat in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of legal scholars and philosophers. "Men like Damien don't have ex-wives. They have liabilities. He'll have you followed. He'll monitor your accounts. He's not just closing a chapter. He's sanitizing a narrative." "I know," Nora replied, her hand resting on her barely there bump. "That's why we can't just hide. We have to fight." Arthur looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw not the fragile society wife, but the sharp, intelligent woman he had raised. The Vance blood, dormant for a decade, was finally stirring. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "You said he built his empire on foundations you helped him lay." Nora began, her voice low and steady. "And then he pushed you out. Tell me everything. Every deal, every investor, every corner he cut." And so Arthur began to talk. He spoke of the early days when Damien Blackwood was just a hungry, brilliant young man with a chip on his shoulder. He spoke of a crucial seed investment from a Swiss consortium, an investment Arthur had brokered. He spoke of a tech patent Damien acquired under questionable circumstances from a struggling startup. He detailed a pattern of behavior leveraging inside information, aggressively squeezing partners and burying contractual obligations in labyrinthine legal clauses. "He's a shark who was taught how to swim in my waters," Arthur concluded, his voice heavy with regret. and I was too proud or too foolish to see the size of his teeth until he'd already taken a bite out of me. Their first call was to Julian Hayes. Julian's father had been the Vance family's lawyer for 40 years. Now the younger Hayes was a rising star in corporate litigation, a razor-sharp lawyer with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. He arrived at the brownstone the next day, his demeanor discreet and his eyes missing nothing. He listened to Nora's story, then to Arthur's. He read the divorce papers and the NDA, his expression grim. "This is a fortress," Julian said, tapping the thick stack of papers. "Damien's lawyers are the best in the business. On the face of it, you have no recourse. The prenup is airtight, and this NDA essentially silences you from ever speaking about him, his business, or your life together." "There's always a crack in the fortress," Nora insisted. "We just need to find it." Julian leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The NDA has a standard clause. It becomes null and void if Damien is found to have engaged in criminal activity. It's boilerplate, meant to protect the signatory from being an accessory after the fact. His lawyers would have assumed it was an impossibility. A man like Damien doesn't get caught." A slow smile spread across Nora's face. "Then our path is clear. We don't attack the divorce. We attack the man." The war room was Arthur's study. Walls that had once held maps of ancient civilizations were now covered in whiteboards, charting the corporate structure of Blackwood Global. Julian brought in a forensic accountant, a discreet woman named Evelyn Reed, whose mild appearance belied a mind that could untangle the most complex financial knots. While this quiet storm was gathering in the West Village, Damien and Chloe were playing out their perfect love story for the paparazzi. They were photographed buying baby furniture at exclusive boutiques, attending charity functions hand in hand, and giving carefully curated interviews about their whirlwind romance and shared vision for the future. But behind the scenes, the gilded cage was simply being redecorated. Chloe, who had imagined herself a partner, was quickly discovering she was a prized possession. Damien was controlling his obsession with the pregnancy absolute. He dictated her diet, her social schedule, even the color of the nursery. His paranoia, which had always simmered beneath the surface, was growing. He had private investigators put discreet surveillance on Nora, convinced she was plotting something. The PI, a former NYPD detective named Mike Corrigan, was good at his job. He reported back to Damien that Eleanora Blackwood was living a quiet, reclusive life with her father. She visited the library, went for walks in the park, and met with an old family friend, a lawyer named Julian Hayes. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Corrigan didn't report the late-night sessions in Arthur's study. He didn't see Evelyn Reed arriving with encrypted hard drives. He didn't hear the hushed phone calls to retired executives and disgruntled former employees of Blackwood Global. He saw a broken woman licking her wounds. He didn't see a general assembling her army. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn Reed found the first crack. It was buried in the code of an offshore subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, a company Damien had used to acquire a biotech firm 5 years prior. "It's a ghost code," Evelyn explained, pointing to a string of data on her laptop screen, a set of transactions that appear and then are erased by the system's own logging protocol within microseconds, but they leave a digital echo. She typed furiously. This echo points to a hidden payment schedule. Payments made to a shell corporation owned by the lead regulator who approved the acquisition. Julian leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming. "Bribery." "Classic textbook bribery," Evelyn confirmed. "Hidden in plain sight. Arrogant." Nora looked at the screen at the string of numbers that meant nothing to her, but she understood everything. This was the first stone. and she knew exactly where to throw it. Damien Blackwood was a man who thrived on control. He controlled markets, he controlled narratives, and he controlled people. The news of Nora living quietly with her father should have placated him, but it did the opposite. It was too neat, too clean. The Eleonora he knew, the one with a core of Vance steel beneath the silk exterior, would not go down this quietly. His paranoia gnawed at him. He orchestrated a subtle but vicious media campaign. Anonymous sources later traced back to a PR firm on Blackwood Global's payroll began whispering to gossip columnists. They painted a picture of a troubled Eleonora, emotionally fragile and prone to hysterics after years of struggling with infertility. They hinted that the separation was a tragic necessity, a kind of mercy killing for a marriage that had been on life support for years. Damien was framed as the heartbroken husband, forced to move on to find the happiness and family he so deeply desired. Chloe was the innocent, swept up in a love story, not a home wrecker, but a life-saver. The narrative worked. Public sympathy, fickle as ever, began to shift. Nora was no longer the wronged wife, but a pitiable figure, a relic of a failed past that Damien had bravely moved on from. "He's not just divorcing you, he's rewriting history," Arthur said, tossing a copy of the New York Post onto the coffee table. The headline read, "Billionaire's Heartbreak, Blackwood's Ex Unstable After Split." Nora barely glanced at it. Let him. The higher he builds his pedestal, the harder he'll fall. Her focus was singular. With the information from Evelyn Julian drafted an anonymous encrypted email. It was a masterpiece of implication containing just enough verifiable data about the biotech deal and the offshore subsidiary to be tantalizing, but not enough to reveal their hand. It didn't make a direct accusation. It simply asked the right questions. The email was sent from a secure server to one person, Amelia Vance, a second cousin of Nora's, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Amelia, bound by journalistic ethics, could never reveal her source. But the tip was too good to ignore. She began to dig. Meanwhile, life in Damien's penthouse was beginning to lose its luster for Chloe. The thrill of victory was fading, replaced by the reality of her new role. She was the vessel for the Blackwood heir, and her identity was shrinking to fit that single purpose. Her opinions on business, once so valued by Damien, were now dismissed. "You should be resting," he'd say. "Don't stress the baby." She found herself watched constantly, not just by the household staff, but by Damien himself. He questioned her diet, her sleep, her phone calls. One afternoon, he found her on a call with her sister and demanded to know what they were discussing. "We were talking about baby names, Damien." She snapped, a flicker of her old fire returning. "The name is already decided," he stated coldly. "He will be named Damien Blackwood, Jr." "What if it's a girl?" she challenged. His face tightened. "The doctors are certain it's a boy. There will be no mistakes." The implication hung in the air. Mistakes would not be tolerated. Chloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the penthouse's aggressive air conditioning. She was a placeholder, a means to an end. She had won the Billionaire, but lost herself. The first tremor hit Blackwood Global 2 weeks later. A small article appeared on page A12 of the Wall Street Journal written by Amelia Vance. It was titled "Regulatory Questions Surround 5-Year-Old Biotech Merger." It named no names, made no direct accusations, but it detailed irregularities in the approval process of the very deal Evelyn had flagged. It mentioned a key regulator who retired to a lavish lifestyle in the Caribbean shortly after the deal closed. It was a whisper, not a shout, but in the halls of finance, a whisper can be an avalanche. The stock of Blackwood Global dipped by 3%. It wasn't a catastrophe, but it was a warning shot. Damien was incandescent with rage. He stormed into his office, a whirlwind of fury. "Find out who talked to the Journal," he roared at his legal team. "I want a name. I want them ruined." His lawyers, however, came back with nothing. Amelia Vance was a fortress, her sources legendary for their anonymity. The trail was cold. Damien's suspicion immediately fell on Nora. He called Mike Corrigan, the private investigator. "I want more," Damien snarled into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. Bug her house, her phone. I want to know what she orders for dinner and what she dreams about at night. She's behind this. I know it." "Mr. Blackwood." "That's highly illegal," Corrigan replied, a seasoned professional who knew where the lines were. "I can maintain surveillance, but I can't break the law." "Then find someone who can," Damien retorted, and slammed down the phone. But Julian Hayes had anticipated this. From the beginning, he had operated on the assumption that they were being watched. He had a cybersecurity expert sweep the brownstone weekly for bugs. All their sensitive conversations happened in a specially secured room in Julian's office. They used burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. Damien's brute force was being met with surgical precision. The small stock dip, however, had an unintended consequence. It spooked investors. To calm the markets, Blackwood Global had to open some of its books for an internal audit to prove the company's stability. It was a standard procedure, but Julian and Evelyn had been waiting for it. They had a contact on the inside, a junior accountant, who had been passed over for a promotion in favor of one of Damien's cronies. The man was bitter and looking for payback. Late one night, Julian received another encrypted file. It was a treasure trove. Internal memos, hidden expense reports, and most damningly a preliminary geological survey for a mining operation in South America. The survey, which Damien had buried, showed a catastrophic risk of water table contamination for the local indigenous communities. The official report submitted to the environmental regulators had been a complete fabrication. This wasn't just bribery anymore. This was a potential humanitarian and ecological disaster. It was fraud on a massive scale with devastating human consequences. Nora looked at the report, her stomach churning with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. "He didn't just push my father out," she said softly. "He didn't just humiliate me. This is who he is. He poisons everything he touches." The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. The leak of the fraudulent environmental report needed to be handled with extreme care. A direct release would be too obvious, tracing a clear line back to a disgruntled party. Nora, guided by Julian's strategic mind, opted for a more insidious route. They wouldn't give the story to the financial press. They would give it to the people Damien had wronged. Julian used an anonymous intermediary to deliver the buried geological survey to a small, fiercely independent environmental advocacy group that had been protesting Blackwood Global's mining operations for months. He also sent it to a respected international human rights lawyer based in Geneva. The effect wasn't immediate, but it was potent. The advocacy group, now armed with irrefutable proof, organized larger, more vocal protests. The story was picked up by international news outlets not as a business story, but as a human rights issue. The name Blackwood Global was suddenly associated with images of endangered communities and poisoned water. The brand Damien had spent decades building, the brand of a visionary and a philanthropist, was being tarnished with a stain that money couldn't easily wash away. Damien was besieged. The board of directors, once pliant and deferential, was demanding answers. Government regulators in 2 countries opened official inquiries. The stock, which had recovered from the first dip, now began a slow, steady bleed. The crisis consumed all his time and energy, pushing his carefully constructed personal life to the periphery. His paranoia, once a simmering ember, now blazed. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He became more controlling, more volatile. His relationship with Chloe, already strained, began to crack under the pressure. One evening, Chloe tried to broach the subject. "Damien, the news. Is any of it true?" she asked tentatively, gesturing to the television, where protesters were chanting outside a Blackwood Global office. "It's a smear campaign," he snapped, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Orchestrated by my ex-wife. She's trying to ruin me because she couldn't give me a son." The casual cruelty of his words struck Chloe. She had been his partner in ambition, yet he spoke of this monumental crisis as if it were a simple domestic squabble. She saw then that in his world, everything and everyone was transactional. Love, loyalty, even their unborn child, they were all assets or liabilities in the grand ledger of his ego. Her own secret began to feel heavier. The lie she was carrying was a ticking bomb, and she was standing right next to it. Nora watched the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of her father's home. There was no joy in it, only a grim sense of necessity. Every headline that condemned Damien was a shield for her and her child. Her pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and she was now beginning to show. The secret was becoming harder to keep, but for now her reclusive lifestyle kept it safe. Julian believed it was time for the next step. "His attention is divided," he argued during one of their strategy sessions. "He's fighting a war on 2 fronts and bleeding capital. Now is the time to hit him at home." The hit was a legal filing. It wasn't a lawsuit for more money. It was a petition to invalidate the NDA. The grounds were specific and explosive. Nora alleged that she had been coerced into signing the agreement while under extreme emotional distress, and more importantly, that she had reason to believe Damien Blackwood had engaged in fraudulent activities. During their marriage activities, she could no longer be legally bound to stay silent about. The petition was filed in a state court, known for being tough on corporate malfeasance. It was a declaration of war. The filing was a matter of public record, and the media pounced on it. The vague whispers of Nora's instability were now countered by a formal legal allegation of corporate crime. The narrative Damien had worked so hard to control was shattered. When Damien was served the papers, his rage was volcanic. This was a direct assault. Nora wasn't just leaking information. She was putting her name on an accusation. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal. He immediately called his lead attorney a ruthless legal shark named Marcus Thorne. "I want her destroyed," Damien seethed. "Countersue, defamation, slander. I want her left with nothing. Not even her father's dusty old books. A countersuit is risky," Marcus advised, his voice calm and steady. "It opens you up to discovery. They'll be able to subpoena documents, communications. I don't care. She is lying." "Is she?" Marcus asked, the question hanging in the air. "Damien, before we go nuclear, you need to tell me. Is there any fire underneath all this smoke? Any of it?" Damien was silent for a long moment. "My business is my business," he said finally. "Just crush her." But Marcus Thorne was a lawyer, not a magician. He knew that a legal battle once started was an uncontrollable beast. And he suspected that Eleanora Vance Blackwood, represented by the clever Julian Hayes, was not coming to this fight with an empty gun. The first strike had landed, and the damage was far more than financial. It had pierced Damien's armor of invincibility. It had sown doubt among his allies and emboldened his enemies. And for Nora, it was a profound moment of reclamation. She had taken back her voice. The quiet, graceful wife was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her strength ready to face the man who had tried to erase her and protect the future growing inside her. The legal battle became a grinding war of attrition. Damien's lawyers filed motion after motion to have Nora's petition dismissed, but Julian Hayes countered each one with meticulous legal arguments. The discovery process began a slow, agonizing exchange of documents. Julian's team sent out a blizzard of subpoenas, requesting everything from Damien's personal emails to the minutes of board meetings going back a decade. Marcus Thorne's team did the same, demanding Nora's medical records, diaries, and correspondence, hoping to build a case that she was an unstable, vindictive source lashing out. But Nora had lived a transparent life. There were no hidden skeletons. The only secret she kept was the one nestled safely in her womb, a secret her doctors, bound by confidentiality, would not reveal. The pressure on Damien was immense. His company was now facing multiple government investigations. His stock price was in a tailspin, and his personal life was the subject of a very public and very messy court case. His legendary focus was fractured. He grew short-tempered and paranoid, trusting no one. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that Evelyn Reed, the forensic accountant, made her most devastating discovery. It wasn't in a corporate ledger or an offshore account. It was in the payment records for a high-end, extremely discreet fertility clinic in Switzerland. Damien Blackwood has been a patient there for 15 years. Evelyn reported to Nora and Julian, her voice flat with professional calm. He started treatments long before he even met you, Nora. The diagnosis is consistent across every test: azoospermia, 0 sperm count. It's congenital and irreversible. The room went silent. Nora stared at Evelyn, her mind struggling to process the information. All those years, all the invasive treatments she had undergone, the hormones that had ravaged her body, the crushing sense of failure and inadequacy she had carried. All of it had been a lie. He knew. Nora whispered the words, catching in her throat. The whole time, he knew he was the one who was infertile. He let you take the blame, Arthur said, his face pale with fury. That monster let you believe you were the failure. The cruelty was breathtaking. He hadn't just discarded her for failing to produce an heir. He had discarded her for his own failing, making her the scapegoat for his own biological inadequacy. His obsession with a son, a legacy, was the desperate cry of a man who knew he could never naturally create one. And then the final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Chloe!" Nora said, her eyes wide with a dawning, sickening realization. "Her pregnancy!" Julian nodded grimly. "If Damien can't have a child, then the baby she's carrying. It isn't his." The implications were staggering. Was Chloe lying to him? Or was this something even more twisted, a scheme they had concocted together? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mike Corrigan, the private investigator Damien had first hired, had been quietly let go after refusing to engage in illegal surveillance. He was a man with a moral code, and he'd been disgusted by Damien's obsessive rage. He reached out to Julian Hayes. "I don't like what Blackwood was asking me to do," Corrigan explained, meeting Julian in a quiet coffee shop. "But I did my job before he fired me. I ran a background check on the girlfriend, Chloe Sterling. There's something you should see." He slid a file across the table. It contained travel itineraries. 6 months before the gala, Chloe Sterling had taken a vacation to a renowned fertility clinic in California, a clinic that specialized in IVF and anonymous sperm donors. The dates lined up perfectly with the timeline of her pregnancy. She wanted the billionaire's life, Corrigan said, and she knew what he wanted above all else, so she went and got it for him, or at least made him think she did. Chloe had played Damien just as ruthlessly as he had played everyone else. She had secured her position with a child that looked like a Blackwood heir, but shared none of his DNA. She had given the Baron King his legacy, a legacy built on a complete and total fraud. This was the secret that could destroy him, not the corporate crimes which he could fight with lawyers and money, but the personal humiliation. The revelation that his entire narrative, the potent billionaire securing his dynasty, was a pathetic lie. His son was not his son. His virility was a sham. His legacy was a stranger's bloodline. Nora now held the ultimate weapon. It was a weapon of such devastating power that it could not just ruin Damien Blackwood's company, but annihilate the very core of his being. The question was no longer how to fight him, but how to deliver the final fatal blow. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened where it all began, the Park Avenue penthouse. Nora, through Julian, requested a face-to-face meeting with Damien to discuss a final settlement. She insisted on two conditions: that they meet alone and that they meet in their former home. Fueled by arrogance and a belief that she was finally ready to capitulate, Damien agreed. He dismissed Chloe to an afternoon at the spa, wanting to savor this final victory by himself. When Nora stepped out of the private elevator and into the penthouse foyer, she felt a strange sense of detachment. The space that had once been her prison now felt small and insignificant. She was no longer the woman who had tiptoed through these marble halls, desperate for a scrap of affection. Damien was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in his hand, the Manhattan skyline his backdrop. He looked haggard, the stress of the past few months having etched new lines around his eyes, but he wore his expensive suit like armor. "Eleonora," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. This whole affair has been unseemly." "Has it, Damien?" Nora replied, her voice calm and clear. She walked further into the room, her presence filling the space in a way it never had before. She was 5 months pregnant now, her condition tastefully concealed by a flowing silk blouse, but she carried herself with a newfound strength. "End this nonsense," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "Withdraw the petition. Sign a revised NDA. I'll even increase the settlement as a gesture of goodwill. Consider it a severance package for your years of service." Nora almost laughed. The audacity, the sheer unadulterated ego of the man. "I'm not here for your money, Damien. I never was." "Then what is this all about?" he demanded, his patience thinning. "Revenge. A pathetic attempt to hurt me because I moved on." "No," she said, stopping a few feet from him. "This is about the truth." She began to lay it all out, not with anger, but with the cold, precise finality of a judge delivering a verdict. She started with her father, Arthur Vance, detailing how Damien had used his mentorship and connections only to cast him aside once he was no longer useful. "A necessary business decision," Damien scoffed. He was sentimental. He lacked the killer instinct. "Then we can talk about the South American mine," she continued, her voice unwavering. "The real geological survey. The one that shows you are knowingly poisoning thousands of people to protect your profit margin." His face darkened. Allegations. Lies fed to you by my enemies. And the biotech acquisition, she pressed on. The payments to the regulator's shell company, Evelyn Reed, is quite the artist when it comes to uncovering digital ghosts. Damien's composure finally cracked. He slammed his glass down on the table. What do you want, Nora? Just name your price. I told you, she said softly. This isn't about money. She took a deep breath, preparing for the final devastating revelation. This is about legacy. Your precious legacy, the son you announced so proudly at the Met Gala. A flicker of confusion, then suspicion, crossed his face. For 10 years, Damien I subjected my body to grueling treatments. I injected myself with hormones. I endured countless humiliating procedures. I carried the weight and the shame of our childlessness, and you let me. You watched me cry myself to sleep month after month, and you let me believe I was broken. It was a tragedy. But stop lying, she interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like glass. I know about the clinic in Switzerland. I know about your diagnosis, azoospermia, a congenital condition you've known about since you were a young man. The problem was never me, Damien. It was always you. The color drained from his face. The armor was gone. He looked at her, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He was stripped bare, his deepest, most shameful secret exposed. That's impossible, he whispered, the words hollow. Is it? Nora continued, relentless. Which means that Chloe, well, she is as ambitious as you are, I'll give her that. She knew what you wanted, what you needed to feel like a man. So she went to a clinic in California and bought it for you. An anonymous donor, Damien. That's your legacy. The son who will carry the Blackwood name shares none of your blood. Your entire dynasty is a lie. He stared at her, speechless. The entire edifice of his life, his ambition, his very identity had crumbled to dust in the space of 30 seconds. He had destroyed his marriage, tarnished his company, and humiliated his wife, whole for a future that was a complete fabrication. Nora placed her hands on her own stomach, a gentle, protective gesture. You see, the ultimate irony, Damien, is that you threw away the one thing that was real. She turned and began to walk away. He found his voice, a ragged, desperate sound. Nora, wait. Is that? She paused at the door of the elevator, turning back to face the broken man standing amidst the ruins of his life. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of malice or triumph, only a profound, quiet finality. He is your son, your only son, and you will never be a part of his life. The elevator doors slid shut, leaving Damien Blackwood utterly and completely alone with the wreckage of his truth. He had lost everything, not because of a corporate takeover or a market crash, but because he had fundamentally misunderstood the meaning of value. He had traded gold for dust. The silence that descended upon the penthouse after the elevator doors closed was a physical entity. It pressed in on Damien heavier than any market pressure he had ever faced. For a long time, he didn't move from the spot where Nora had left him, the city lights below, blurring into meaningless streaks of color. The architect of a vast empire, the master of a universe of his own making, had just learned his entire cosmos was a lie. The foundation wasn't cracked. It had never existed. When Chloe returned from the spa, radiant and relaxed, she found him standing in the near darkness, the fallen Scotch glass still shattered on the floor. Damien, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, her smile faltering as she sensed the frigid atmosphere. He turned to face her, his expression devoid of the fury she might have expected. It was something far worse, a hollow, dead emptiness. "The performance is over, Chloe," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "She knows." Chloe's blood ran cold. "She knows what the business deals, the petition. Everything." He cut her off, the single word carrying the weight of total annihilation. "She knows about Switzerland. She knows about California. She knows that the child you are carrying is not mine." There was no accusation, no rage. It was a statement of fact, a final grim tallying of the accounts. Chloe, ever the survivor, didn't crumble. Her own mask of the doting mother-to-be fell away, revealing the hardened ambition beneath. "So what now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Now you leave," Damien said. "A wire transfer will be made to an account of your choosing. It will be substantial. In return, you will sign a document, an NDA of your own, and you will disappear. You and the donor's child will cease to exist in my world." He didn't care about her betrayal. In his mind, she had simply been a contractor who had failed to deliver the correct product. The transaction was terminated. There was no emotion, no heartbreak. There was only the cold, brutal calculus of damage control. She had been a means to a fraudulent end, and the fraud had been exposed. The next 72 hours saw the complete and systematic dismantling of Damien Blackwood. News of the Swiss clinic and Chloe's deception strategically leaked by Julian's team to a single trusted source detonated in the press. The story was a media supernova, a perfect storm of corporate malfeasance, personal hubris, and shocking betrayal. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a fool. His carefully cultivated image of potent masculine power was replaced with that of a deluded, sterile tyrant. The public mockery was perhaps more damaging than the SEC investigation. The emergency board meeting was a formality. The men and women who had once deferred to his every command now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer a titan. He was a liability of catastrophic proportions. He signed his resignation without a word, his signature once a symbol of immense power, now just ink on a page, admitting defeat. As he left the Blackwood Tower for the last time, a work crew was already preparing to remove the towering silver letters of his name from the facade. While Damien's world was imploding, Nora's was acanding in quiet, concentric circles of joy. 4 months later, in a private room in a quiet hospital, she gave birth to Arthur Vance Jr. The birth was peaceful, attended only by her father and a trusted doctor. Holding her son, for the first time, Nora felt a love so profound and absolute it eclipsed all the pain that had come before. He had her emerald green eyes and a stubborn tuft of dark hair. He was perfect. He was real. Her father, Arthur Sr., held his grandson, tears streaming down his face. "This Nora," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is legacy." Nora's first official act as the head of the newly chartered Vance Foundation was to fully fund the legal and environmental restoration efforts for the South American communities whose lives Damien's mine had threatened. She flew down to meet with the community leaders herself, with baby Arthur safely in the care of his grandfather. She didn't send a check. She went in person, listening to their stories, her presence a quiet promise that integrity could triumph over greed. The press called it poetic justice. For Nora, it was simply the right thing to do. It was the first brick in a new foundation, one built not on power, but on principle. A year passed. The name Damien Blackwood faded from the headlines, becoming a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. He lived in self-imposed exile in a stark, modern villa in an undisclosed European location. He had his fortune, but he had lost his name, his purpose, and the one thing he now craved above all else, a connection to the son he had thrown away. Sometimes he would see a picture of Nora and her child in a magazine leaving a park, entering a museum, and he would be consumed by a sterile, powerless rage that eventually faded into a familiar, gnawing emptiness. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nora was in the garden behind the West Village brownstone. The house, once a symbol of her estrangement, was now a vibrant home, filled with the sounds of a happy baby. She pushed Arthur on a small wooden swing her father had hung from the old oak tree. The late afternoon sun filtered through the golden leaves, dappling the ground in light. Her son laughed, a pure, uncomplicated sound that was the anthem of her new life. She had done more than survive. She had healed, she had built, and she had reclaimed not only her family's name, but her own soul. The ghost of Damien Blackwood no longer haunted her. He was a chapter in a book she had long since finished reading. Her story was no longer about betrayal. It was about the beautiful, unfolding future embodied in the joyful laugh of her son as he swung higher and higher into the light. In the end, Damien Blackwood's empire didn't fall with a crash. It dissolved in the acid of its own lies. Faced with irrefutable proof of fraud and the soul-crushing humiliation of his personal life, he was forced out by his own board. He lost the company, the penthouse, and the fake legacy he had sacrificed everything for. Chloe vanished, taking her own secrets with her. But this story isn't truly about the fall of a titan. It's about the rise of a queen. Eleanora Vance Blackwood, now simply Nora Vance, gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Arthur. She didn't seek revenge. She sought restoration. Using her inheritance and her father's guidance, she established a foundation dedicated to ethical business practices and environmental justice, turning the poisoned legacy of the Blackwood name into a force for good. She proved that true strength isn't about how much you can control, but about what you choose to build. Her story is a powerful reminder that the most perfect-looking lives can hide the most painful secrets, but also that our deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest liberation. What did you think of Nora's ultimate decision? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of resilience and justice, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will stay with you long after you've finished listening. Thank you for joining us.